Hello and welcome to Music City Murder, a podcast meant to give people an insight into the history behind Nashville's most infamous murders. The show is hosted by author T. Blake Brady. You can find his novels at Parnassus Books in Green Hills, as well as on Amazon. Fans of James Lee Burke's Dave Robichaux series will probably dig these books too. One last thing before we begin. If you like what you hear, be sure to rate and review Music City Murder on the Apple Podcasts app. It's the little purple icon on your phone. Reviews help to distinguish the show from millions of other podcasts out there. A 5-star review is appreciated, but it doesn't matter what you say. No one is sure how it helps, but it definitely does. It has something to do with the algorithm, I think. Anyway, let's get on to the show.
Hello and welcome. As the intro says, you are listening to Music City Murder. I am your host, Tyler, and we're going to dive right in to this week's insanity. My sources for this week are a Nashville Scene article and something from a site called Only in Your State. So I'll post those in the notes, but let's get to the actual case. We're going to be talking about some pretty graphic stuff today, so just maybe don't have the kids in the car when you listen to this episode, because we're going to be talking about axe murders. And no, not the kind featuring Mike Myers from the mid-90s. That's a deep cut. But axe murders, and by extension axe murderers, were once a thing. A real true crime phenomenon. It's a highly specific kind of crime. But there was a time when it wasn't unheard of for an entire family to be hacked to pieces, only to have the killer disappear into thin air and never be seen again. This is one of those cases. However, I do want to give a little bit of context to axe murders in general, since they occupy a weird corner of the true crime world, and I might not get back to another axe murder case in the near future. Let's start with perhaps the most famous of these cases, and that is the Axeman of New Orleans. In the post-war period of 1918 to 1919, a serial killer was active in the Crescent City. Presumably he, would sneak into someone's house and use their own axe to attack and kill them. So he would sneak in, grab an implement from the house, an axe, and then murder 1 to 2, even more people. Sometimes this killer would use a straight razor, but mostly it was an axe. And one thing I heard but can't verify is that these axes weren't the kind of sharp tools that they are today. They were a little more dull and a little more bludgeony. So they were blunted. And the murders were, the outcome of this is that the murders were even more bloody, prolonged, and horrific than you'd probably even imagine. At least that's what I think of. Most of the victims were Italian immigrants or Italian Americans. So some people believe that the murders were ethnically motivated. I mean, that's not definitive, because some other people also say they were sexually motivated, since it appears that the Axeman only killed men when they stood in the way of the killer's female victims. The fact that the crimes remain unsolved means that anyone can come up with a believable theory as to who might have been the Axeman of New Orleans. The Axeman of New Orleans abruptly stopped his crime spree in 1920, and many people believe it's because the perpetrator of these crimes was killed but never quite identified. So crime writer Colin Wilson speculates that the Axeman could have been a man named Joseph Momfre, Momfre, a man shot to death in Los Angeles in December 1920 by the widow of Mike Pepitone, the Axeman's last known victim. Wilson's theory has been widely repeated in other true crime books and websites. However, true crime writer Michael Newton searched New Orleans and Los Angeles' public, police, and court records, as well as newspaper archives, and failed to find any evidence of a man with the name Joseph Momfrey, or similar name, having been assaulted or killed in Los Angeles. Newton was also not able to find any information that Mrs. Pepitone was arrested, tried, or convicted for such a crime, or indeed had been in California. Newton notes that Momfrey was not an unusual name in New Orleans at the time of the crimes. It appears that there actually may have been an individual named Joseph Momfrey or Mumfrey in New Orleans who had a criminal history and who may have been connected with organized crime. However, local records for the period are not extensive enough to allow confirmation of this or to positively identify the individual. Wilson's explanation is an urban legend, and there is no more evidence now on the identity of the killer than there was at the time of the crimes. But anyway, let's get to our own Nashville case. We're going to go all the way back to 1897 to a place called Paradise Ridge, which is within Davidson County, but is not Nashville proper. It's in the northwest corner of the county, up near Cheatham on the county line. I'm going to discuss a little old-time geography here, so it's going to be a small little diversion from the case, but it's not because I want to bore you, but I think it will illustrate how this story comes together. Again, it's 1897, and Clarksville Pike, the road, doesn't exist yet. So to get to this place called Paradise Ridge, you can go a couple of ways. One of which is an old road from Dry Fork up Germantown Hill to Morney. I'm going to back up a little bit and discuss that Morney, that's Morny, is now just considered Jolton. But it was at the time, at the turn of the century, also informally known as Germantown because of the number of German families who settled in the area. Not the same Germantown that's over across the river in Nashville. One of those German families was the Ade family, A-D-E. But the best pronunciation I got was Ade. It could be Ade, but I think it's Ade. I'm going to settle on that. I don't want to have another Desprez situation. So I think my pronunciation is correct, but if there's any confusion, just chalk it up to the lack of details that exist about this family. We're going to start with Jacob Ade. He's a 57-year-old or 67-year-old guy. The article I read, the typeface it was an old newspapers.com article, and it was really faded and pixelated, so I think it was 57, but it could have been 67. So Jacob Ade and his wife, Pauline, had lived along Clarksville Road for 20 years. Well-liked and prosperous, they had over 400 acres of farmland and a 5-room house valued at just over $10,000, which would be easily over $250,000 in today's money. His modest fortune had been made in stocks and bonds, which is good for this area. And in that same article on newspapers.com, Jacob is described as being well-liked, like I said before, by all of his neighbors, save for one. A man named Ed Anderson, who lived about 1 mile west of the Ade household. The week before the events we're going to discuss, Ade had Anderson arrested for stealing 3 hogs from him. That's definitely an 1897 kind of crime. Now, the Ades were not just prosperous in wealth, but they were prosperous in family. They had 6 children: Emma, Rosa, Anna, Henry, Lizzie, and Dora. 5 girls, 1 boy. That poor child. Emma, Rosa, and Anna were adults and no longer lived on the Ade farm. They lived in Nashville proper or elsewhere. Dora, who was 10, lived in Nashville. Dora, who was 20, lived in Nashville with her husband. Lizzie, who was 20, and reports vary on Henry's age, but he was older than Dora and younger than Lizzie. So some kids in the house, some kids not in the house. That will explain some of what happens later. At the time, there was a young woman also staying at the Ade residence. The Nashville Scene article describes her as Rosa something, and I think that is acceptable. Rosa something. The reason for this is that her name has a half dozen different spellings. Different reports have her as Rosa Morier or Morier, Morier, Moirer, Morrier, and Morrer. So lots of different spellings. Not great records being kept. We are also unclear as to her actual age. Some reports have her as young as 10 years old, while others have her as 20, which is a huge discrepancy. But that's kind of the way things were in the 1800s, especially since, I will mention this later, but something happened to historical census data that was destroyed. And so it was difficult to have accurate records around this time. Those same reports state that her father was a Frenchman. That's a word in quotes, though it's unclear if he was from France or just of French descent. Remember, a lot of French immigrants like the Demonbrians lived in Nashville at the time, so it was heavily a place for immigration. And the author of the Scene article, to kind of put a stamp on this, Betsy Phillips, looked at historical census data to find Rosa's father, Henry, but there was no such data. The fact that the 1890 federal census was destroyed kind of limits the available information. Okay. Lots of family stuff, lots of geographical stuff. So just to recap, there are several people living in the household on the night of March 24th, 1897, which is a Wednesday. Jacob and Pauline, those are the parents, Henry and Lizzie, the kids, and Rosa, the friend. Earlier in the week, Jacob had gone to Nashville proper to withdraw $200 to loan to a guy named Tom Williams. He turned the money over in the courthouse, and so the money itself was not in the home that night. That was kind of the last time people saw Jacob Ade live. On the night of Tuesday, it was a Tuesday, March 24th. 25th is on a Wednesday. On the night of Tuesday, March 24th, 1897, at about 9:30 p.m., one of the neighbors woke up to see that the Ade house was on fire. Thinking the family was either gone or had fled the disaster, he went to save the meat from the smokehouse. As people do. This is the phrase that's used in the Nashville Scene article, and given what happens next, I find it extra disturbing. So after a wall collapsed in the house, the neighbor, whose last name was Simpson, was able to see into the rooms of the house. He saw 2 bundles of clothes in the middle of the sitting room and secured a tool called a potato fork, which kind of looks like a pitchfork, to poke at the bundles. It seems obvious that he was already thinking the worst here, but he came to discover and then retrieve 4 bodies from the burning building. He went to go get another neighbor, S.A. Thompson, so Thompson and Simpson, and they went to tell Henry, Rosa's father, what had happened. The 3 men, Simpson, Thompson, and Henry, waited at the Ade residence until the sheriff arrived, and together they pulled a 5th body from the fire. That one was Rosa. She was recognizable because she still had her head, and the other bodies did not. Okay, I'm going to stop there. The last point about the bodies being headless is a controversial one. One of the comments on the Scene article disputes this point. I would normally put very little stock into a comment thread on a local article, but this one seemed exceptionally well researched, and so I'll probably use some of the details here in a moment. The comment claims that no reputable source reported on missing heads. And to be fair, the newspapers.com article I read also mentioned nothing about decapitated bodies. It is certainly more salacious than just finding dead bodies, so I can see why this might be a detail to include, if people just want to make this a more sort of scary tale. But I can neither confirm or deny it. The true crime fan in me wants it kind of be the most subversive version of the story because it makes it more infamous. But the human being in me wishes it was, just runaway imaginations, that they just died maybe in the fire, smoke inhalation, or, something less horrifying than decapitation. That said, the crime scene itself was likely pretty brutal either way, since an axe was involved. The sheriff, whose last name was Sharp, was notified of the crime at dawn and headed by buggy to the scene, accompanied by the deputy sheriff. Shortly after that, neighbors and other onlookers stood around and measured the damage, rubbernecking, as people are wont to do in these kinds of situations. While that was going on, and this is such a weird detail, a man in a gray suit was seen lurking in the bushes a few hundred yards away. The visual makes it seem like a disturbing detail from a Wes Anderson movie. And I can't say that this is the killer, but it's probably a killer, right? I mean, someone hanging out in the bushes several hundred yards away while the other neighbors are just looking at the details. And if the article I read is to be believed, which who knows, then all of the neighbors showed up at the scene almost immediately, except for Ed Anderson, who had recently been arrested for stealing Jacob Ade's hogs. Anderson does end up showing up around 1 p.m., wearing clothes that looked eerily similar to the ones worn by the Wes Anderson character skulking around in the woods earlier in the morning. And this is a detail I can't stress enough, even if it is sort of apocryphal. And it makes Anderson look even more guilty. I mean, doesn't it? I mean, we use Occam's razor here. It makes Ed Anderson seem like the guy. That is not to mention the fact that people loudly excoriated Anderson at the burn site, implicating Anderson for the crimes. So even the people at the time believed Anderson was the killer. Sheriff Sharp, the sheriff at the time, his theory was that the murderer knocked on the door at the Ade residence and whacked Jacob on the head when he opened the door. And that subsequently, other members of the family kind of rushed to his defense and were then also killed. Pauline moved toward the door and was struck down. And the murderer or murderers then went into the children's room to take care of them, at which point Rosa managed to escape. I mean, temporarily. The killers finished off the children and then recaptured Rosa, hacked her up, and then threw her body back into the burning house before departing. Here was where the two killers theory came in. They believed that one of them killed the children while the other rushed out to capture Rosa and bring her back. And it makes sense since the bodies were kind of all together, close together. The sheriff naturally went looking for answers, and almost immediately he found a star witness to aid in the investigation. The witness, a mostly blind and deaf German shepherd. The sheriff called his, quote, secret witness. The dog had been hiding behind a brick enclosure at the far corner of the property and came out when called. Like I said, he was mostly deaf and blind and also only had a few remaining teeth. Poor guy. So, how Sheriff Sharp planned on using the animal in the investigation, I'm not sure. But apparently he did think this, and pretty quickly the idea was dropped. Thank God. I just can't imagine what could have been going through the man's mind. But when you have a case where there's no clear answer, I suppose you'll just kind of go for anything that might be considered evidence. The first suspects arrested in connection with the crimes were not indeed Ed Anderson and someone else, but two African-American men. Since crimes were often pawned off on black men and women in the post-Reconstruction era, this development should be a surprise to no one. Eventually, though, the two men were released since, in their forced confessions, they claimed to rob and kill the Ades for robbery's sake. There was no robbery that took place, or no evidence of robbery. Hence, the confessions were likely given at the end of a nightstick or worse. Ed Anderson was considered a suspect, but there's no evidence that he was ever put through the justice system in any significant way. So that's inconclusive. I mean, as guilty as he seems to look to any of us, we don't have any evidence that they actually took him in. Rosa's father was also considered a suspect, but townspeople at the time didn't buy that. He seemed genuinely distraught at his daughter's death, so it's probably not a theory that would take you anywhere. 2 other men were arrested for the crimes because they were walking near the house at the time of the events. But eventually, they were acquitted and let go too. And unfortunately, that's kind of where the case dries up. No one's ever going to actually be sent to prison for the crime. So your guess is as good as mine as to who's guilty for it. It seems like a pretty remote location for this to be a random crime. Honestly, I mean, it doesn't seem like it would be something like the Axeman of New Orleans, hopping a rail and riding into a German immigrant sort of part of Nashville. The problem is, we don't have a lot of information surrounding the murder, so it's difficult to make a pronouncement as to who might have done it. The most obvious answer, I think, is that a neighbor had something to do with it. I mean, it's mitigated by the fact that it is a quite brutal murder. I mean, all murders are brutal and, on their face, but this one seems especially brutal. It's not just a stabbing or a shooting. There is the sort of salacious element of using an axe. And beyond that, there's nothing typical about any of this. So it could just as easily be the neighbor doing something horrific to make a statement. I mean, I just don't know. Especially Ed Anderson, who seemingly had an ongoing feud with the paterfamilias of the Ade clan and would have sufficient motive to do something bad to him. Maybe it was jealousy, maybe it was greed, but he certainly seemed to be involved in one way or the other. At least if you go by, what facts we do have surrounding the case. Today, the space that was known as the Ade Farm is still partially a farm and partially a subdivision called Jacob's Valley. You can't even tell that a gory axe murder even took place there. And I guess we should all be thankful for that. Because with the history of this country, there's a lot of violence that perhaps has gone noticed and been pushed to the underground, the subterranean, if you will. And this is yet another case of that. A case that was never solved and likely will never be solved. So whatever hypothesis you bring to it, you're likely to be as correct as anybody else. And that, my friends, is the Ade family axe murders, also known as the Paradise Ridge axe murders. This is your host, Tyler. I want to thank you guys for listening to this episode of Music City Murder. Make sure that you go and rate and review the podcast and give it 5 stars. Doesn't matter what you say, as long as you say something. It helps with the algorithm, I think. And make sure you subscribe, all that stuff. You know what to do. If you're listening to this podcast, chances are you listen to other podcasts. And I can't wait to be back with a new episode on the horizon. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time on Music City